Previously, I've talked about some platform issues for our politicians in the 2024 election. I'd like to rethink some platform issues, some new, some just readdressing, some additional thoughts in light of some of the news stories I've seen, comments from y'all, etc. Since I last posted on this topic. And periodically, I want to put out some ideas because I'd like to see some specific propositions made and discussed, addressed, debated, and acted on so that we can actually address some of the issues that ought to be addressed. Now, what ought to be addressed at the federal level is a whole different topic, and we'll get into that in other contexts as well. But here are some specific issues that I think are generally agreed upon ought to be addressed, and I'd like to make some preliminary suggestions as to some of the topics or issues that we could consider in addressing them. So, first of all, the issues related to federal office holders. It seems to me that we spend way too much time on the back end debating issues about who our office holders are, how they're handling their things as far as their personal business related to their elected business, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to suggest that one of the things that we do just to try to help keep honest people honest and dishonest people out is require an annual tax audit of every elected official. That is just part of the agreement or understanding that if you are running for elected office and you win, that you're going to be audited on your taxes. Might also entertain the idea that any appointed position has the same requirement, and in order to try to eliminate some of the actions that may or may not be questionable, right, wrong, etc. But if we have an audit and everybody has to account for what they did and who they did it with and who paid for it, et cetera, then that might help eliminate some of the questions that we debate, usually to no avail, after the fact. Establish a standing, nonpartisan, non-congressional committees to investigate allegations of wrongdoing against elected officials and federal employees. Seems to me that we spend way too much time simply talking about problems that people are involved with or are accused of being alleged to be involved with, and not enough time actually investigating in a timely fashion and holding accountable actual cases of wrongdoing. It seems like most of the judgments, convictions that we get are not related to the case that's under investigation, but peripheral issues such as obstructing justice, et cetera, in the context of conducting the investigation. So we need to have a more efficient way than having Congress investigate these things, whereby when there are credible claims of wrongdoing, or if there are claims of wrongdoing, then the committee can determine if they're credible and take appropriate action to investigate in a timely manner. Eliminate unfunded pension funds for any aspect of retirement. I honestly don't know how much of this is related to the federal government, but the unions and everything else, the degree to which we have pension funds that are unfunded but guarantee essentially limitless payments for the duration of retirement, et cetera, we need to eliminate those and ensure that any promised payments are payments that can be handled with money that's in the bank. Eliminate stock trading for members of Congress and congressional staff and their immediate families. It's not clear to me why this hasn't already been addressed, other than Pelosi and just enough people were successful in helping her stop this. But this gets back to number one, the tax audit. We need to put guardrails in place to ensure that those who are making decisions with respect to what's in the best interest of the country are as minimal as possible influenced by decisions that would be for or against their own personal interests. The military. This is one of the issues. It's a hot button issue, but I think that for way too long, I know that I have just assumed that yes, the military needs to be strong, it needs to be paid for, we need to have a strong military. But particularly over the last couple of years, I've been thinking more about, well, what exactly is the military being used for? What does it mean to have a strong military vis-a-vis the rest of the world, even if we are, or especially because we are the only world superpower? How, in fact, is our military being used? And so, in light of some of these questions, I would suggest that we ought to freeze military spending uh, in the midst of the threats of China, the threats of Russia, the threats of the next pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. There are always reasons for spending more money, but the military has been pretty unsuccessful. The Pentagon has been pretty unsuccessful in accounting for the money that it's been spending over the last several decades. We ought to institute an annual 10% reduction in the Pentagon's budget until it has passed an audit 2 years in a row. As I recall, the Pentagon has failed the last 5 audits, and the audits that it has undergone have not even been done in a timely fashion for the laws related thereto. The military has simply gotten so large, our footprint has gotten so large around the world that we can't even keep track of ourselves anymore. And so we keep spending and raising money, and yet when our budget is the highest in the world by a factor of 10, as I recall, to the next closest military budget in the world. And we got to wonder why in the world we are spending so much money to police the world, even if we should be policing the world, which is a whole nother debate. And I would suggest if we're going to be true to the tenets of democracy, we should not be policing the world. Stop sales of all military hardware around the world. Part of the problem that we have in the world with respect to the volume of war, the deadliness, the cost of war, et cetera, is that we are providing the means by which war can be waged, whether we do it intentionally or through sales or unintentionally through lost equipment, through abandoned equipment, whatever it might be. We have militarized the world, and we wonder why peace is hard to come by. Require congressional approval for the deployment of any U.S. forces or armaments anywhere in the world. Do not recall the last time that Congress declared war, but the declaration of war, as I recall, was to be made by Congress, the execution of war to be administered through the office of the president. But we've gotten to a position where we have troops engaged in conflicts all around the world, and there's been no war declared. It's been for whatever reason we've used to justify doing so, but we need to restrict the president, I don't care which party, the president's ability to deploy troops. We need to restrict the deployment of U.S. military equipment and funds um, by requiring Congress to be in the loop with respect to approving those funds and then answering back to their own constituents as to whether that approval and the distribution is justified. Taxes. Close known loopholes in existing tax laws, such as the carried interest deduction. I saw a podcast recently that listed, and I'll try to find that, but listed 10 actions that can be taken right away to clean up the tax code and collect more taxes that, based on law, ought to be collected, but based on poorly written law, intentionally or otherwise, are not being collected. And so we need to clean up the tax code that we have and restructure it altogether. Eliminate taxes on federal payments such as Social Security. It's not clear to me. I was pretty surprised when I realized that Social Security is in fact taxed. Social Security representing payments made into the system to be drawn on in old age. It doesn't make sense to me that we are actually taxing the payment of those funds. And so we ought to eliminate those taxes. And even more surprising to me was that there is a cap on income which is subject to Social Security tax. We need to eliminate that cap and collect income on everything that is, collect a tax on all income that is brought in. And we need to, I didn't list this, but I mentioned it before in a previous video, we need to make sure that we redefine income to account for any increase in spending power that a person realizes over the course of a year. And then finally, establish a 100% tax on income over $100 million. Now, whatever the top level might be, 100 million, 50 million, 200 million, the higher you push it, the fewer individuals that are affected. The degree to which we add additional levels of taxation, so that say you have 40% on anything up to 40 million, 60% on anything up to 60 million, 80% on anything up to 80 million, then 100% over 100 million. However we want to do that, it's, to me, it seems inconceivable that the founders would have had any idea the degree to which wealth could be generated. The argument that people are just following the laws, et cetera, that as if they are set in stone, as opposed to laws that have been put in place by our legislature, to me is a red herring, a straw man. It misses the point. The people who benefit from the um, business environment ought to realize the benefits, but not at the expense of everyone else, in the sense that you have this growing and discrepancy in income or in wealth between the upper and the lower classes. I mean, one thing about it, money that is spent will always be going towards the upper classes, the business owners, the owners of a capital, etc. Those who are going to spend the money most quickly are those who have the least amount of money. The poor can't afford to hold on to money, invest or save money. They're going to put it right back into the system. And so it's never really made sense to me that we talk about keeping money in the hands of the few when they may, in fact, set up systems whereby jobs, et cetera, are going to be generated, but it's always the lower incomes that are going to turn around and spend the money more quickly. I'm not talking about collecting these taxes to redistribute them through government programs. I'm talking about collecting these taxes to be paid out in ways that the government ought to be distributing or paying for services, et cetera, which is a whole other debate. But the idea that there ought to be an open-ended earn all you possibly can and don't pay any taxes or pay minimum taxes on it needs to be brought to an end. Federal funds, develop a budget in which 10% of receipts are dedicated to paying down debt. Again, we spend too much time. We're going to fund the military, or we're going to fund social programs. We need to identify what our federal government ought to be doing, allocate resources to that based on available income to the government. And we've gotten ourselves into such a debt loop that we need to make paying that a priority, because it's not going to pay itself. The whole modern monetary theory idea I've talked about before, but I don't think that that's a viable economic theory for the long run. I think it's an economic theory, and in fact, I think they say as much. It's an economic theory that is simply an analysis of how we've been operating for the last few decades, but it doesn't take into account the long-term ramifications. There is no substitute for having a material backing to the dollar bill. The faith in government of the United States as the backing for the dollar bill is going to wear, and I think we're seeing signs already, is going to wear pretty thin at some point. There's no substitute for being able to take your dollar bill and convert it to $1 worth of gold, as opposed to $1 worth of promises from the federal government. And we need to get a handle on our budget and a handle on our debt and make that a priority. Pass a law that shuts down FedNow, prohibits the development of a central payment system. Digital currency, I believe, is also another way that it's talked about. But the degree to which people are talking about the federal government running a banking system through which every transaction takes place ought to be anathema to anybody who believes in individual freedom. The ability to take a dollar bill and use it anywhere on anything with nobody any the wiser ought to be preferred over a system whereby any transaction you make can be identified by anybody who has access to that information. Because anytime information is retained, somebody who doesn't want to do well with it, someone who wishes you evil, will at some point be able to get a hold of it. And it's the whole idea of a central banking system operated through the federal government, where the federal government can know every transaction that you make financially, ought to send a shiver down our spines, because that's anathema to freedom. And so we need to eliminate the FedNow program that they've recently implemented, or as I record this, I think will be implemented in the next month, and eliminate any further investigation into a central payment system operated by the federal government. And we need to restructure our banking system to eliminate banks and financial institutions that are too big to fail and redistribute banking institutions across the U.S. From the very beginning of the too big to fail framing of institutions, financial, business, and otherwise, it seemed to me like that was antithetical to the ideals of capitalism, in which failure is part of the business cycle and an opportunity for others to pick up on the lessons learned from those who failed so that others have an opportunity to do better. The argument I heard recently about everything's electronic, we don't need regional banks, we don't need local banks, on the one hand makes sense because so much of our banking is in fact electronic, so much of our financial activity. I can't remember the last time, other than opening a new account when I moved to a new town, that I walked into a bank to handle any banking business, or even went to a drive-through. For many years, I didn't walk into a bank; I just handled everything through the drive-through. Now I never go to the bank, or practically never. But that doesn't mean that having a local banking presence isn't important. That having the decentralization of our financial system isn't important if we want to have a system that is not dependent upon the decisions of a few, on the whims of a few, on the wishes of a few, as opposed to a system whose strength lies in the interconnectedness of the many. So we need to eliminate too big to fail and reinstitute banks across the country. Eliminate the adoption of unfunded liabilities. Not only do we do a horrible job at creating budgets, which I don't think the federal government has had an actual budget that's been approved for decades now, we do way too good a job of paying for things on the fly just because there's some presumed emergency that is developed. And so we keep accumulating obligations based on emergencies that may or may not actually be emergencies, but we don't actually address how to pay for them, how to reconcile the accounts, always kicking the can down the road until at some point the U.S. and her debt load is going to be too big not to fail. Higher education, eliminate federal loan guarantees for student loans. The whole student loan program became a problem, and the whole student loan issue became a problem the moment the federal government started guaranteeing nearly 100% of all student loans. We need to get the federal government out of student loan guarantees. We need to allow student loans to be discharged in bankruptcy. One of the provisos in creating the federal loan guarantee program was that you could not discharge your student loan in bankruptcy. That needs to be changed. We need to cap education loans to no more than average annual pay in the field of study. Providing $200,000 in student loans for a sociology degree is not a long-term winning solution. We need to tie the actual amount of loans to any individual to the actual possible reasonable earning power of that individual upon successful completion of their field of study. We need to close access to federal student loan programs of private institutions whose endowment exceeds the annual cost for all students enrolled. The degree to which student loans make it possible for people who can't afford to go to school and then pay back the loans when they become employed ought to be a part of the public higher education institutions. The degree to which private institutions have endowments and have abilities to cover the cost, provide their own loan programs to the students they wish to enroll in their schools, that ought to be on the private schools. The degree to which people want to say, well, it's these upper echelon universities, the Ivy League schools, etc., that have such exorbitant annual cost that people need to get into to really get into good paying jobs and fields of power. Well, we can distribute that power, distribute that control by, in fact, securing good quality educations at other colleges and universities, rather than presuming that it's only at the Ivy Leagues and other high cost universities that you're going to be able to get an education of value, not just for future earnings, but for the value of the education itself. We need to cap the interest on student loans to no more than 50% of the interest for a house loan in the quarter prior to the time the loan is issued. So on January 1st, you look back and see what was the average of a house loan in that quarter, or what was the closing Bell house loan at the end of the fourth quarter of the previous year, and take half of that, and that's the interest rate that you're going to be allowed to charge on any student loan initiated in that subsequent quarter. The degree to which an education and house ownership are means to a middle class life and an opportunity to establish stability financially and socially, etc., we need to tie those two together instead of the system that we have now, where a generation of students are essentially shut out of the housing market because of their indebtedness and the student loan fiasco that we have going on. Now, this whole discussion is only going to apply to those who choose to secure a higher education. Not every job requires a higher education. Not every good paying, solid job requires a higher education. I would suggest that a higher education, at least certain classes, certain fields of study, are beneficial even if they have no direct relation to the job that one is doing, simply because of what you can learn and how you can become a better person by studying certain things, history, philosophy, religion, etc. So the whole idea here is to address higher education, to ensure that higher education costs are in line with the higher education payout, and to help avoid perpetuating the student loan crisis that we have going on in our system today. Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate your time and look forward to hearing what you have to say about each of these. Again, these are just thoughts in progress. It's not a final document by any means. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about these and other ideas that you have on your mind for what we want our politicians to do in 2024. Thank you much. Bye-bye. Thank you very much for your time. I've got a couple other videos listed here if you'd like to take a look at those, and as I'd like to discuss issues related to politics, religion, society, and how in the world we're supposed to understand ourselves and life in the world. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.